Hello, my name is Sam Bauer. I am the head of ecology, biodiversity and arboriculture at Balfour Beatty, and I have the pleasure of talking to you today a little bit about biodiversity on our projects, and especially biodiversity net gain, and how that is going to be changing things within the construction sector over the next few years. But before we get started, I would just like you to take a moment to have a look at this picture and reflect on the words that conjured up in your mind for how you describe this. We're all going to look at this picture very slightly differently. Maybe you'll be thinking about the type of habitat it is, or the time of year, particular species that are there, perhaps. The point is, we're all looking at the same thing, but there's slightly different ways and nuanced ways of describing it. And the same is very true when it comes to nature as a whole. So you will have probably heard all, or at least many of these terms used before. Some of them you may be very familiar with, some of them less so. The point is they're all talking about the same thing, they're just coming at it from a slightly different angle, a slightly different priority. So today we're going to be focused on biodiversity, but we will be drawing on some of these other terms as we go through, no doubt. Now, biodiversity is a phrase which, or a term which has become much more commonly accepted and used in the populace over the last few years and last couple of decades. But it might be worth just taking a moment just to zero in on exactly what we mean by this phrase, because it is or can be often misunderstood. This chap here, E.O. Wilson, he's dubbed the father of biodiversity. He didn't actually come up with the phrase. However, he was very important and pivotal in its acceptance within the wider academic circles and also within the population as a whole. I won't read that out for you, you can read that yourself, but it's a very good example of what we mean when we talk about biodiversity. And it's interesting that biodiversity tends to get broken down into a species model. So here we go, as an example of where we fit at a species level into the wider biosphere. As you can see, we are a very, very small cog in a very much larger machine. But given the extent of our impact, we punch well above our weight. You can divide biodiversity into different modes. So you could talk about genetic diversity within species, which is also very important when it comes to longevity and resilience for particular species. So why does biodiversity matter? Why do we talk about it? Why do we care? Well, arguably it's important for its own sake and of value for its own sake, but also biodiversity is fundamentally important for ecosystem functionality. Simply, the greater the diversity of the biological component of a habitat, the more resilient it is to change, the more adaptable it is to change. And in order for an ecosystem to function, it needs to have this adaptive quality. So if you think about the picture that we started off this slideshow with, the woodland there, that's a lowland broadleaf woodland. Now, one component of that woodland is ash. In fact, a very large component of that woodland is ash. However, it is a very complex and diverse habitat with a whole range of different tree species. Now, that ash has been very adversely impacted, as across the whole country has been, by ash dieback. And now in that woodland, the ash is all but gone. Now, there are some specialized species, invertebrates and so forth, that are dependent on ash, but generally speaking, despite the loss of that one core species within the habitat, because there's such a diversity of other tree and shrub species, the functionality of that woodland endures. And this is a prime example of why diversity is so important. If you contrast that with, say, a single stand of monocrop ash and what would have happened to that woodland had it been impacted by ash dieback, you would have lost the woodland in its entirety. The reason why ecosystem functionality is so important is because it is what delivers the systems which we as a living entity are dependent upon. So we break it down into natural capital, which is the asset. So biodiversity is an example of a natural capital asset. This delivers various types of ecosystem services. So for example, you've got provisioning, regulating, supporting and cultural. And from those services, we are rendered a number of goods. So it might be carbon storage, flood attenuation, food, also nutrient cycling, air quality, And there's lots of things like mental health and well-being and so forth. So having a functioning ecosystem is vitally important in order to actually get these goods. Or to put it simply, if you like to breathe air, if you like to drink, have access to water, have access to food and medicines, or a wide range of medicines and other goods, having functioning ecosystems is fundamentally important. And this is which leads on to our rather alarming state of where we are in the world at this present time. It's estimated we've lost close to 70% of our biodiversity globally since the 1970s. And it's worth noting that it was already pretty hammered by the time we got to the 1970s. This means that ecosystems are ceasing to function. We are losing ecosystem functionality on a global dimension. And this is going to have an adverse impact on life on this planet, effectively. In fact, the scientific community are broadly in agreement that we are in the 6th extinction event. So the last one, the 5th one, was the one that took out the dinosaurs. We are now in the Anthropocene extinction. And that means, well, the last time when the dinosaurs were gone, it took several million years in order for life to evolve to a state where the ecosystems could support large vertebrates, such as us, for example. So this is, and I don't like to use this term willy-nilly, but it truly is an existential crisis which we're facing. And it's from this situation that biodiversity net gain has been brought in. In the UK, we are not doing very well either. We're roughly, well, we've lost about 50% of our biodiversity since the Industrial Revolution, which puts us in the bottom 10% globally and the worst performing in the G7. So although you may see lots of green and pleasant land out there, and there is undoubtedly lots of greenery, the diversity is massively impacted, which exposes us to a considerable threat when changes such as adverse weather events, climate change, flooding, the ability for these ecosystems to restore is considerably hampered. So, biodiversity net gain. The function of this is basically to try and address this issue, and it is looking at all development projects at pretty much all scales to address the biodiversity crisis, and at a project level or wider if necessary, try and achieve a net gain in biodiversity to make the situation better for having been there rather than worse. It works by breaking biodiversity into three core components. Do that one again. The way it works is it breaks the system into three core components. So you have the habitat, what it is we're talking about, so be it woodland or grassland or what have you, the condition of that habitat, and then the area that it covers. I'll go more into this in a minute, but at this point, it's worth remembering we have an existing model that we're very familiar with using and have been for many decades of ecological mitigation. This tends to bias at the beginning when you have an impact assessment of some kind. Then that will dictate methods that are used through the build process. It might be that this requires, putting up boxes or taking things down in a sensitive manner, soft felling, that sort of thing. And then it would tend to be that the landscaping is thought of afterwards, as unfortunately in some instances as an afterthought, where the tree planting or seeding or whatever it needs to happen is done after construction. So this is the standard process. Now I realize this is a very simplified model, and actually it's more complex and there's more interrelation than this, but in broad terms it tends to follow this kind of generic pattern on projects. The way that biodiversity net gain works is, for starters, there is a core requirement of a minimum 10% for all projects. Now that means, in actual fact, for some projects it'll be greater than that, because some local authorities are requesting or stipulating 20% or different ratios. So the net gain should be considered a bare minimum. Net gain, unlike the previous model, which may have allowed for kind of sequential thinking, it's vitally important that it's integrated throughout the construction process. I'm going to talk about this more in just a moment. but it's vitally important that this net gain is given full consideration at every stage of project delivery. And the aftercare is considerably greater. We are talking about a minimum 30 years. So that is going to radically change what would be the standard model, perhaps of 1 or 2 or maybe 5 years aftercare. The condition is going to be assessed over a minimum of 30-year period. With the 10%, it's worth noting that some habitats are classed as irreplaceable, so things like veteran ancient trees or ancient semi-natural woodland. If you are impacting on those with your projects, then you will not be able to, at a project level, achieve biodiversity net gain. With the integration through construction, we need to be following the mitigation hierarchy. Avoidance is by far the best principle. If you everything that is impacted will need to be addressed, and this includes temporary works as well. So as by far and above, if you can avoid impact altogether, this will benefit you considerably for your project delivery. And then with the aftercare, there are some incentives to start earlier. So rather than waiting until the end of the project, if you can do habitat creation, or at least partial habitat creation or enhancement early on, that will be benefited and is reflected through favourable scoring with the metric. The standard ecological model, which I've talked about, which you're familiar with, mitigation, protected species, that all still applies. Net gain is an add-on, it's not a replacement. So we'll need to be, as we go into our projects, cognizant of the fact that both of these apply. It's not that one is replacing the other. There are implications across our projects, across disciplines, and across dynamics of the projects. So how we lay out our site in terms of what's in and outside of our red line, this will have a direct influence on our net gain targets and requirements. With procurement, making sure that we have the right level of expertise and specialists involved, biodiversity specialists, but also landscaping as an activity. Habitat creation is not the same as landscaping. There are commonalities. You're still putting trees in the ground, for example, but there is a difference, and it's very, very important that our subcontractors and contractors have got the right level of expertise in order to be delivering habitats rather than just landscaping plans. Materials management, there are potentially all sorts of impacts there, particularly earthworks. How we manage our soil is vitally important. If we get it wrong, it can be next to impossible to create certain habitats. We've got to, as an industry, really advance our thinking and our abilities in terms of our soil management. There are program implications. I've already talked about the incentivization of doing works early. And then if you have done works early, it's safeguarding those areas so they're not impacted by future works. The communications, both within the project, making sure that the idea and the requirements of net gain are fully integrated throughout the project delivery team, but also in our engagement with stakeholders and third parties and clients. And there is a cost. This will all cost more. This needs to be factored in, both the delivery during the project, but then that aftercare. Someone is going to need to be taking that up, footing that bill, and that cost needs to be reflected somewhere. And as I've mentioned, it needs to be incorporated throughout the project delivery team. So we're familiar with ecological and biodiversity issues being associated with site clearance and the landscaping, but as I've already mentioned, getting the soils right, the earthworks operations can be fundamental. If you get it wrong, it will cost you, or it could cost you, a considerable amount of money to put it right. And net gain is a core project deliverable. It's not just a nice to have, it is a necessity which consent, planning authority, what have you, will be dependent on, contingent upon. But it also factors in other things like with drainage. Perhaps there's opportunities there. Perhaps you can incorporate biodiversity into sustainable urban drainage systems rather than just having everything buried underneath the ground. With structures, maybe you can incorporate green walls, green roofs. There are opportunities to be had there. And the key thing I mentioned, the reason I have utility stress there, is making sure that the program is properly accounting for things like, if you created a woodland, you don't want to have to do a utility run through that and take it all out towards the end of the project or halfway through the project, because that will impact on your net gain score. So the takeaway from this is, make sure that you have the biodiversity team or biodiversity individuals integrated in your team as early as possible. Make sure they're integrated across the team, talking to all the different aspects of your project team, so the commercial team, the program team, the construction team, operatives, everyone. And it needs to be sustained. It's not just to start and finish. They need to be there or have influence and be available to support throughout the project delivery and for this long aftercare period as well. I've got a little bit of a technical point here on how NetGain works, but I'm going to race through this because we're running low on time. But basically, your habitat is assessed on the distinctiveness of it, what makes it important. The condition is assessed through observable factors. So it's not just how the woodland makes you feel, it's what is the botany that's there, what are the floristic communities, and also what are the threats, what are the are there invasive species present? Is there vandalism or other anthropogenic factors? All of these will go into how that condition is assessed and the targets for how you can deliver net gain. And there is a recognition within the metric how it's scored, the complexity of that habitat. Some habitats, so for example, species-rich grassland, provided you get the soil right and the correct seed mix, is relatively straightforward to deliver. Whereas a complex habitat like a woodland, which has got a whole variety of different biodiversity and different structures and so forth, that is going to be more complicated and it's going to take a lot longer to achieve the net gain target. And that is reflected in the metric. And then finally, you have the area. So that is going to be done as hectares if it's a parcel, and it will be in kilometers if it's a linear habitat, such as a river or a hedgerow. It's worth noting if you're impacting on a linear habitat and a parcel habitat, you will need to achieve 10% net gain for both of those. So you can't get 6 in one and 4 in the other. It has to be 10 and 10. So again, where you draw your red line, it's going to be very, very important. There is a hierarchy of value, so you will have to do less if you achieve your net gain on site. This is the priority. This is the optimal solution, is to try and achieve net gain on site within your red line boundary or your blue line. Offsite solutions are potential, but you will have to do more. And with offsite, locality is considered favorable. And then if that's not achievable, the last option is statutory biodiversity credits, but these will be the most expensive option because these are to be the least favorable. It's worth noting that it's not just extent of habitat, but the condition of that habitat that can deliver net gain. So, for example, if you have a woodland which is chock full of invasive species, if you manage to remove and eradicate those invasive species and you have a control plan, management plan over the next 30 years, which is going to make sure they stay out, then that will maybe a way of achieving some of your points towards your net gain. So it's not just about area, it's about how the area is managed and what's there. So it is a change. This is a dramatic shift in thinking. We're looking beyond just the wall of protected species and the mitigation we're familiar with, but we are thinking about habitats, habitat mosaics, functioning systems that work to deliver ecological benefit. So we're thinking more about niches and different features, and those aren't just to do with what we're planting or seeding, but also structural things. So the topography, creating more interesting topography, hydrology, the way that we can use different substrates, for example, to create areas of bare ground or so forth. All of these work together to create these much more diverse and important, interesting habitats, which is the target, rather than it just being about lizards or dormice or bats, which is what we're all more familiar with. So it is a dramatic change, and as an industry we are going to need to change rapidly and dramatically with it. Some types of habitat loss simply won't be acceptable anymore. And I'd just like to leave you with this concept of blue-green infrastructure, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a really good way of pulling together these different ideas. So pulling together the idea of biodiversity net gain, the ecosystem services, which I talked about at the beginning, and natural capital. And fundamentally, as a construction industry, we are all about creating assets and managing those assets. And in fundamental terms, that's exactly what we're doing here. It's just that these assets are living ecological systems. In actual fact, the difference between doing this and building houses or roads or railways, it's not that different. The technicalities are different, but the principles are the same. We need to create assets of the highest possible value, and we need to manage them and maintain them to deliver their functionality as optimally as possible. And that is where I end. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much for that, Sam. Really interesting discussion there. So we've got limited time for questions. I'll move quickly into those. I've got a couple that are kind of lead into one another. And it's really about that interface. Obviously, in your talk, you were very clear about the need for there to be good communication between, all throughout the process, and get contractors involved at an early stage. Stephanie Smith's talking about that early stage, saying a lot of positive influence rests with the planning and designing of a construction project, and there's a lack of understanding in those areas sometimes. So I guess the question is, how, because contractors sometimes can end up with schemes and think, oh, we've got to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear here. How do we get them involved at an early stage, the planners, to really pick that up? And then what's the best stage for them to get the contractors involved? And we're talking about the early stage, but is it really at that very early planning stage talking to them?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can start those conversations too early. Really, the sooner the better. It's very important that whatever's gone into that biodiversity net gain plan has been rigorously supported by site awareness. So you've got good analysis as applicable to the scale and the type of the project, but you're not trying to create a type of habitat which is completely not suited to the type of soils which are going to be on that habitat, for example. Just because it looks nice on a CAD drawing doesn't mean it's actually going to work in practicality. So you can't start that process too soon. It's worth remembering, of course, that as it becomes mandatory, the consents in order to have planning or a DCO, you're going to have to evidence net gain already by that stage, or at least be a long way towards it. So there really isn't any, it shouldn't be an opportunity for there to be misunderstanding in terms of the client at any point. And yes, it's just integrating that team of the designer and the construction leads as early on as possible, and making sure you have the specialists involved, not just the biodiversity specialists, but the habitat creation specialists, which, as I talked about earlier on, is this, they're not exactly the same thing,
Yeah. So is there a role for subcontractors as well? This is a quick question from Luke Deemer. Be interested in how piling companies, insulation companies can impact biodiversity in projects as a subcontractor.
Actually, this is actually stepping away from biodiversity net gain into the bigger context. So COP15, which is the recent UN biodiversity forum or framework, there was something called the Global Biodiversity Framework, and target 15 of that is about reporting of biodiversity impacts. Now, at present, it's not mandatory, and it is in its current wording only applicable to certain scales of business. However, just as with carbon, there is going to be a need to be reporting. So there is going to be, over the next few years, probably a considerable lean in towards much greater accountancy and awareness and assessment of the biodiversity impacts, and that happens throughout the supply chain, and in all disciplines.
Great, thank you very much. This is a huge topic, and I'm sorry we don't have more time to really dive deeply into it, but that was a great presentation and really, really important stuff. So thank you very much.